Thank you everyone for listening in today. This week, as I was thinking of this sermon, I saw something in this text. We're going through the book of Daniel, and this week we're talking about chapter 4. And I saw something here that I never really noticed before. And the theme seems to be, in exile, what is God doing? What is God working towards? So in the previous weeks, we've seen Daniel and his friends go through many trials in exile. So they've been depending on God, they've had faith, they have stood firm, and they've held on to their Jewish identity in a pagan land. And we can see the similarities in our current age. But there's another character here who we can really forget about, and he has a huge part to play in the book of Daniel. And that is King Nebuchadnezzar. And you see, we've been following the story of the Jews living in exile under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel has been selected to work in his court. So in Daniel 1, we have the king being impressed with Daniel and his friend's wisdom. In Daniel 2, we have the king's vision and Daniel interpreting it for him, showing that his kingdom will eventually fall and God's kingdom will last forever. The king here is now introduced to the God of the Israelites. King Nebuchadnezzar is introduced to Yahweh, and that God is the one who gave the dreams and interpreted it. So that's something no Babylonian god could do. So he knows about God's power, but he doesn't follow him. In Daniel 3, we have the story of Daniel's friends not worshiping the golden statue, and they're rescued from the fiery furnace by God. So here we see King Nebuchadnezzar setting himself up as a god, and the one true God showing him who is in control. King Nebuchadnezzar then realized how powerful the Jewish God is, and he commanded no one to speak against him. But still, in chapter 3, he does not follow God. In Daniel 4, and this is what's very interesting about this book, is it's written in the perspective of King Nebuchadnezzar. It's written in Aramaic, which would have been the language of the people at that time. Some other chapters in Daniel are written in Hebrew, so they were written for a Jewish audience, but this is written for the people. And it's likely, actually, and some scholars agree, that this was probably a public proclamation sent out in his kingdom after his experience with God. And it's about God humbling him and the king glorifying and praising God. This is something we see at the end of chapter 4, that King Nebuchadnezzar is actually glorifying and praising God, recognizing that God is in control, not him. So what we see is that even though Daniel 1-4 has been about God working through his people in exile, as well, God has been working towards bringing some of those Gentile people to him. And we see this in the end of chapter 4, because it really seems like King Nebuchadnezzar came to God. The last we know of him is he is praising and glorifying God. So God is still doing this work today. He is still working through events in our society as well. And he's getting them to come back to him. That's what God is working through us even, to bring his people back to him. And as we see through this story, we have a big part to play in that as Christians. That God, for some reason, decided to work through us in the conversations we have with people. And those conversations can have a lasting impact, even if we don't see it right away. That's not to say that the Holy Spirit is not working in people regardless of us, because that is true. But God does use us. As well, we see here in this text that there is one major thing keeping people from God, and that is pride. As well, we see there is one major thing that brings people to God, and we see that's humbleness. So King Nebuchadnezzar was in a position that only a few people in history had ever been in. So all of the world that King Nebuchadnezzar knew about, he controlled it. He ruled it. Now, he didn't control the whole world, but all of the known world that he really cared about or knew about, he was in control of. He was absolutely in power. There were no other armies or empires at this time that could bother him. So he was completely alone in his rule. And in verse 4, it says he was alone in his palace, content and prosperous. So none of us will get to the level of this king. In fact, no world leader today was as powerful as this king. Obviously, we have more technology and stuff than King Nebuchadnezzar did. But no king, no president is as in control, as in charge as King Nebuchadnezzar. He was the law. He was absolutely in control. He wasn't voted in. He was in for life. And not only was he supremely in charge, he deserved to be in charge. So he commanded armies and conquered any who came before him. So he conquered his empire. He didn't command from the back, but was a warrior who led his army on a chariot. And he accomplished more in his life than almost anyone is capable of. And this is why he's such a terrific example to learn about pride. We all have pride issues. All of us do. And most of us think we deserve to think highly of ourselves. So my hope today is that you will see truly what pride is and how it keeps many from being in a relationship with God. Pride is like a terrible disease, and the treatment for it can be painful, but it needs to be dealt with. And for all of us who have been humbled, it can be really painful. It can be hard, but it is absolutely essential in our walk, especially in our society. We need to put to death any thought that we are God, any thought that we are in charge. So first we're looking at our pride. So first we're going to be looking at Daniel 4 verses 28 to 30. So we see in 28 to 30, earlier in this chapter, King Nebuchadnezzar has a vision. And ultimately what this vision stands for is that God put King Nebuchadnezzar in charge. King Nebuchadnezzar was prideful, and so unless King Nebuchadnezzar changes his ways, he will be humbled, but later restored to power. So in verses 28, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar didn't learn from this vision. So in 28, King Nebuchadnezzar, it says, 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" So King Nebuchadnezzar looks at all that he has done. His empire, his buildings, everything. So Babylon is historically thought to have had walls 56 miles long, though it would have been 300 feet high and 25 feet thick, so wide enough for 2 chariots to race on top side by side. As well, the Euphrates River ran through the middle of the city and had a half-mile long bridge. There were beautiful temples. His palace was thought to have been the greatest building ever constructed by man up until that point. He had a golden statue and table that was dedicated to one of his gods that weighed over 50,000 pounds of gold. And in today's value, that's around more than $1 billion in today's money. He had all of these things, and more than this, he earned it, or so he thought. He didn't inherit this kingdom. He wasn't given it. He took it by his own hands. He conquered it, led his armies into battle, and won the kingdom. He looked at all that he had done and said, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty?" Now this text teaches us something deep about pride that we might miss. So when we think of a prideful person, generally we think of someone who's full of themselves, someone who's done a lot but doesn't really deserve it. Kind of like a Wall Street millionaire or something, or someone who's is entitled or really given a lot of their money. But here is an important question to ask ourselves. Do we think King Nebuchadnezzar is wrong? We can read this and say, okay, of course, he was prideful. But the definition of pride in our society is this: a feeling or deep pleasure or satisfaction derived from one's own accomplishments or achievements. Now, what's wrong with this? In our society, to most people, there's nothing wrong with feeling good about yourself with the things you've done. That's a good thing in our society. Our society says you need to be proud of yourself. It's part of your identity. But what pride is, and this is as Tim Keller puts it, pride is plagiarism on a cosmic level. Now you see, pride is looking at anything you have or anything you've done or any character in your life and saying, "Wow, I'm great. I did that." And what's wrong with this is that you are taking credit for God's design. You're cutting him out. You're giving him no credit and saying that it is all your own doing. And what we've learned in Daniel is that God's in control. That things don't happen randomly, that God is working out his plan on earth, and he's put in control whoever he wants. And that means that any achievement, any good thing you have because God gave it to you. So here's an example of how this works. So King Nebuchadnezzar went out into battle, he won, he conquered his kingdom. How did God have anything to do with this? We talked about this, how God is in control of all things. God is sovereign. But in this case, King Nebuchadnezzar literally went out. He literally planned these missions and won. Planned these military campaigns and won. So how did God have anything to do with this? How is God given the credit? So think about it like this. God sustained him. God gave him breath. God held him together. God allowed him to win those wars. God allowed him to stay in power. Think about it like this for a second. In the music industry, sometimes musicians write songs and then allow other artists to sing it, to play it. They ghostwrite. But the other artists have to give credit to the original author of the music. They can't say it's their own song because it's plagiarism. They're going to be sued for it. So in the same way, God is the artist who has designed our lives. Everything moves according to his will, and he has allowed us to play it. Yet we can't claim credit for anything. It all goes to God. That means that everything in your life you're proud of, your job, your car, your position, your looks, your stuff, it all goes to God. And in verse 31 of Daniel 4, it says, "The words were still on his lips when a voice from heaven said, 'This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken away from you. You'll be driven away from the people, and you will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes.'" So why is God doing this? Why is he making King Nebuchadnezzar like a beast, like a wild animal? And to understand this, we need to look at our original purpose as humans. So all the way back in Genesis 1, we were made in God's image. We were made to bear his glory. That was our purpose. So when we live for ourselves, when we are prideful, when we take credit for things in our lives, we bear our own glory instead of God's. We are not living in our original purpose. And in fact, what is very interesting here is the more we live for ourselves, the more we live for our own glory and not God's, the more we're like animals, living entirely for our own desires and wants. So what we see here in the curse on King Nebuchadnezzar, it's very prophetic, and all of us can live from this, learn from this, that no matter how much we chase after our own desires, no matter how much we achieve and do, it will never be enough for us. You can look at all the celebrities in our own society who are so unhappy, even though they've done so much. We will never be content with the things of this world. The story begins, interestingly enough, with King Nebuchadnezzar having worldwide power, yet he cannot sleep at night because he's troubled by a dream that threatens his power. He's not content. And as well, we see where living for ourselves goes. When we bear our own glory, it makes us like animals. We live for our own desires. We're completely consumed by our desires, and we don't live for God's glory, and that leads us to destruction. So God humbling us can be incredibly painful. It really is. But the humbling is a treatment to deal with something terrible in us that needs to be dealt with. Think about it like chemotherapy for the cancer that is pride. Our pride leads to our own destruction. It moves us away from God and towards the enemy. And remember, this pride exists in all of us, and sometimes it's so ingrained that we don't even think about it. So our pride will control us, and we have to intentionally fight against it, to root it out and to submit to God. Humbleness is the opposite of pride. Humbleness is submitting to God's will. So what did King Nebuchadnezzar's humbleness look like? So as we know, King Nebuchadnezzar was cursed. He was like a wild animal for potentially 7 years. So he would have been insane, and it's likely that his administrators, Daniel included, would have hid him from public sight. So in verses 34 to 37, it reads, "At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." So King Nebuchadnezzar looked towards heaven, and his sanity was restored. He admitted that God is in control, that God's kingdom endures forever, and that we are nothing compared to him. And he then praised and exalted and glorified the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and his ways are just. Humbleness is the opposite of pride. It's where we thank and give credit to God for everything in our life. It's where we seek to glorify him in everything, not ourselves. It's our constant work of going back towards our original role, which is being image bearers of the glory of God, bearing his image, showing his glory, not our own. And what's fascinating to see is no other religion or belief values humbleness. None of them do. Only Christianity does. All others are either live by your own works, your own righteousness, or they're about taking pride in your own life, survival of the fittest. And what King Nebuchadnezzar learns here is that no matter how much he has, even if he has the whole world under his control, at his fingertips, he really is not in control. He's not God, and he cannot sleep at night because he's terrified of losing what he's gained. He realizes that as humans, we cannot even compare ourselves to God because we are regarded as nothing compared to him. So how can we challenge God and question what he does? He's God. He knows all future, all past, all present, and he's created everything. He stands separate. He stands apart from creation as the first cause. So how can we challenge him saying we know better? And how can we object to the way he does things? We're backseat drivers when we do that. So who here, none of us like backseat drivers. People sit in the back seat and tell us how to drive. And in the same way, we're the ultimate backseat drivers. We question God's plan all the time, even though we don't know where he's going. We have to trust him. Now, the greatest definition of humbleness I ever found was this. It is the bent knee stance of awed and grateful awareness that existence itself is a gift of grace. It's that inscrutable mercy which, having called a person out of non-being, sustains him moment by moment from lapsing back into nothingness. Let me repeat that for a second. It is the bent-kneed stance of awed and grateful awareness that existence itself is a gift of grace, and that inscrutable mercy which, having called a person out of non-being, sustains him moment by moment from lapsing back into nothingness. Recognizing that God holds our very beings together. So our response then as prideful humans, as people who think we know better than God, as people who can bear our own glory sometimes more than God, as people who question God's plan all the time, is to realize that our very existence itself is a gift of grace. That God sustains us moment by moment from lapsing back into nothingness. And that God holds this all together, and only by his grace and mercy that he does it. So how can we say that God is punishing us when this same God holds together our every moment, that our every breath is a gift from him? That even if everything else in our lives is falling apart, the fact that we got to see another sunrise, the fact that we got to see beautiful fall scenery, the fact that we got to feel the heat of the sun or the coolness of the wind is a gift of grace from God. We didn't deserve it. And as for the rest of things in life that we can't explain, the stuff that doesn't make sense like suffering, we have to trust that God knows where he's going. We don't. We have no idea where God's going. We have to trust him. And that we can trust the God who is sustaining us right now. That if God is allowing us to stay alive, if he's holding our very being together, we can trust he knows what he's doing. And we can trust that for the other things in our life that we don't know about, we can trust him. So this chapter is the last we hear of King Nebuchadnezzar, and he finishes with this in 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. And these are the last words of one of the most powerful men in all of existence, praising God in his suffering, finally realizing that God is in control. God is always right, and that God is working in his own plan. And that gives us the ultimate comfort to be peaceful in God's plan, knowing that God is driving this car, God is in control, he's leading you and sustaining you. So what do you need to submit to God this week? What is the pride in your life you need to put to death? That's it for chapter 4. Next week, we're going to be covering chapter 5. Thank you so much for listening to this series on Daniel. Bye.